I must, however, apologize that this talk will be in English because my knowledge of Czech is restricted to words like bus stop or railway station, so this will not be very helpful today. Well, what I want to talk about, not railway stations, but something related, I want to talk about urban areas, and especially about the effects of urbanization on the biodiversity of plants and animal species. And my talk will basically be divided into two parts. One will be on, let's say, an overview of our knowledge. What do we know so far about the effects of urbanization on biodiversity? And second part will be, what don't we know, or where are our gaps in knowledge? And to do so, I will focus on different facets of biodiversity. So I will not only talk about species richness, which will be the first thing I will talk about, but just briefly. But I will also talk about other aspects of biodiversity, such as the functional composition of species communities, functional diversity, phylogenetic diversity, genetic diversity. And I also want to give you some insights into the emerging topic of effects of urbanization on the evolution of plant and animal species, and a bit talk also on the relation of biodiversity to ecosystem services in urban areas. So first, let me start with this research overview. But before I do so, I want to introduce a group of people to you, because what I will present to you is not only a result of my own thinking, but really a result of work in a larger group of people. And all these people you can see up here. It's a group that is the so-called Patterns and Traits Working Group within the network Urbionet. Urbionet is a network that collects data on urban biodiversity for cities across the world and also fosters research and exchange on urban biodiversity topics. And I had the pleasure to join a workshop roughly 2 years ago in New Jersey, which was headed by Myla Aronson, who works there at Rutgers University. And within this workshop, we started a range of different discussions and questions, and it took a while, but slowly now first results are coming in, and I will present some of our thoughts out of this working group today. And every time when I do this, this green Urbionet sign will pop up on one of the slides, so you know, okay, that's now results of this working group. But first, I will mainly show you results obtained by other people, because I try to at least give a rough overview of what we know about urbanization effects on diversity. And I want to start with taxonomic diversity, or to be more precise, effects of urbanization on species richness. So what do we know about this? It has been nicely summed by Ingo Kovarik in a review in 2011, and he said that in the literature there are mainly the pattern for vascular plants that their richness, the richness of vascular plants, tends to increase with urbanization. Or more precisely, if we compare larger urban and non-urban areas, usually the richness of plants in the urban areas is higher. This is due to several underlying drivers, such as high heterogeneity of habitats that we find in urban areas. It's also due to the fact that many of our urban areas were built in landscapes where there was already a high geological diversity, which was interesting for us humans, and also contained a high richness of species. And then it's also due to the fact that within urban areas, we usually have a much higher frequency of non-native species than we have in our non-urban areas, and this also increases the species richness of plants. Still, this is a broad-scale pattern that I'm talking about, so if we really zoom into urban areas, then we will probably find that the number of plant species decreases if we go towards urban centers, but that it's pretty high really in the urban fringe, in the peri-urban areas, where there is also many gardens and a pretty high land use heterogeneity. If we have a look at the species richness of animals, and how this responds to urbanization, then the pattern gets more varied. Of course, because this is also different taxa, not like vascular plants as one larger group. But again, for several groups of animals, there is the trend that these tend to have higher urban than non-urban species numbers. Such patterns were shown, for example, for butterflies, for carabid beetles, and also for birds. But I would be careful here, and I think the pattern is not as strong or not as well investigated as it is for vascular plants. And it seems that if we look at broader animal richness, then really this tends to decrease with increasing urbanization. If we want to better understand why certain groups tend to profit from urbanization, so increase their richness if urbanization becomes stronger and others don't, then it helps to look at functional traits, so at the characteristics of species that make them adapted to certain environmental conditions. And if we do this, then we find that most of the time groups, be them plants or be them animals, that share traits that make them pre-adapted to typical urban environmental conditions, such as high temperatures, pretty dry soils, high fragmentation by steel surfaces, or high nutrient and pollution loads. That species that have traits adapted to these factors usually do well in urban areas, which is logical, while species that don't share traits adapted to these conditions usually will decrease in abundance and richness over time if urbanization increases. And one example is given here. So usually we find that species that are not that mobile, they will decrease in richness with urbanization, and I think it's logical that these less mobile species have problems with crossing all the barriers that we have here in urban areas, such as streets or railways or buildings of any sort. Still, the question is, what drives richness in urban areas? Because urbanization, it's a term that can nicely be used, but still it contains a lot of different economic, social, and also environmental factors, which all might or might not influence species richness. What I show you here is results of a meta-analysis by Joscha Beninde and colleagues published in 2015. And this is, to my knowledge, up to date, probably the most comprehensive meta-analysis of the effects of different drivers on the richness of species in urban areas. And just to roughly explain what you see. So Beninde et al., they collected data from the literature and had a look at the literature, which effects or which factors were analyzed with respect to their effect on species richness. And they did so for a range of taxa, so now this is not only plant species richness, but it's a combined richness of plants and several groups of animals. I don't want to go into detail here. But what you can see is the so-called effect sizes. So here, always in the middle where these black dots are distributed, this is the effect sizes that they took from the different papers. So if a paper, for example, says the size of an area has an effect of this on the diversity of species, then this is translated across all the papers that they analyzed into one effect size. And you see here, just that you explain in the middle line is the zero line. So everything which is right-hand side of the zero line means it's a positive effect, and everything that is left-hand side of the zero line means it's a negative effect of a certain driver on the species richness. And you see on the left-hand side all the different factors that were included in the analysis, such as the size of an area or habitat richness, or, for example, disturbance by humans, pesticide application, and also things like tree cover, shrub cover, microclimate, and stuff like that. And just to sum up, the most important or the main result of this analysis was that biodiversity needs space. It seems pretty simple and maybe oversimplification, but really the strongest effect that they found in their meta-analysis was that the larger a green area is, the more species it can contain, also in urban areas. So it seems the species-area relationships also holds in urban areas, which is nice. Still, this also shows that area is the best investigated factor with respect to its effect on species diversity. And you see there is a lot of other factors that are not that well investigated yet, such as, for example, the effect of pesticide application. There were only few studies that analyzed effects of pesticide applications on urban species richness. So in general, we do know from a range of studies that it's not only environmental factors, but also social factors and economic factors that affect diversity, but there is much more to understand in this respect. But before I want to go deeper into other measures of diversity and how these are affected by urbanization. And I already mentioned that we can better understand why urbanization has certain effects on diversity if we have a look on characteristics of species, on their functional traits. And indeed, functional trait research has been something that has increased, I would say, within the last maybe 10 years within urban biodiversity research. And therefore, I am also able to present you again results of a review on let's say, most of what we know now about trait composition of, in this case, vascular plants in urban areas. The review was published by Nicholas Williams and colleagues in 2015. And they had a look through the literature and looked whether certain strategy types or niche indicators or functional types or functional groups, whether these tend to increase with urbanization, whether they tend to decrease with urbanization, or whether there is no clear pattern, so mixed evidence. And this is what you see with all these gray, white, and black bars here. So if there is a white bar, if you look, for example, on this figure in the middle, the uppermost shows therophytes or annual species, so the response of short-lived species to urbanization. And there you see a long white bar, which means that many studies showed that short-lived species tend to increase in numbers with increasing urbanization. While few studies, the gray bar showed, well, we don't really know, there is no clear pattern. And then even fewer studies, the black bar shows that no short-lived species decrease with urbanization. So just to sum all what you see here up for you, or maybe the most clear patterns that were found, we can say that plant species that do well in urban areas, they tend to be species that are well adapted to high temperatures. This is what you can see here for these niche indicators. So they tend to be adapted to high temperatures. They tend to be adapted to alkaline soil. And this is because within the time of urbanization, we import many building materials into our cities. So the materials with which we build our houses, our streets, most of these materials are alkaline. And in the course of history, parts of this enter urban soils. If you have a look at what urban soils are made of, then you will find not that many natural elements anymore, but many technogenic elements, one can say, such as bricks, for example. And these kind of alkalinize the urban soils, which is also reflected in the vascular flora of urban areas. Then we also know a pretty strong pattern that urban species usually are adapted to high nutrient concentrations, for example, from traffic exhausts, combustion. A lot of nitrogen is fertilizing all our urban landscapes. And then we also know that urban species usually prefer dry soils. So species that need wet habitats usually decrease with increasing urbanization. Then I said there is also a strong pattern that many short-lived species can do well in urban areas, but on the other hand, also trees and shrubs tend to do pretty well. And this then translates, for example, in seed mass being by tendency higher in urban than in non-urban areas, or also height being a bit higher in urban than in non-urban areas. On the other hand, for example, species that disperse their seeds by wind seem to have problems in urban areas, probably because there is many barriers to their wind dispersal, such as sealed and built-up areas. Okay, so you see, for vascular plants, there has been a lot of research about their functional composition within urban areas, the functional composition of vascular plant communities. That's why I could show you a review. For animals, there is no such review yet, so I decided to show you some selected results from a range of paper about some traits which I think are really illustrative about what urbanization can do to animals, and patterns also that have been shown for different species. Well, first I have to say trait research on animals in urban areas is mainly trait research on birds. So if you now expect something on soil organisms, I'm sorry, I don't know any research about this. Well, for birds, one result is that usually birds that breed on the ground, they will not do well in urban areas. So if we divide bird communities by their breeding behavior or nesting behavior, such as done by Dale et al. In the paper which this figure is from, then we will see that birds that have their nest on the ground, they don't do well in urban areas. So what you see here on the y-axis of this figure is the likelihood of urban commonness, the likelihood that a bird species can become common in urban areas. And you see that this is pretty low for the ground breeding birds. It gets higher for species that breed what is called here low, so probably in a shrub, and it gets even higher for species that have their nest up in a tree, or, which is called here cavity, species that breed indoors, so species that use our buildings to build their nest inside our buildings. And these do especially well in urban areas. And nicely, this pattern has not only been shown by one study, but really by several studies, such as, for example, by Concepcion et al. This figure down here, they analyzed a larger landscape in Switzerland and had a look how the proportion of urban areas within this landscape influenced the richness of ground breeding birds. So again, birds that have their nests on the ground. And they found this strong increase of the richness of this group with urbanization. On the other hand, something that supports this pattern for cavity nesting birds being successful in urban areas is a study by Möller from Norway. He analyzed 11 different bird species and had a look whether, if the birds have their nest indoors within a building, whether nest predation rate will be as high as for birds that have their nest outside of buildings. And what you can see in the figure up here is on the y-axis nest predation rate, so how many eggs or nestlings are stolen from the nest. And on the x-axis you can see the proportion of nests that are indoors. And you nicely see that the more nests a species has indoors, the lower nest predation gets. And this nicely shows that birds that can make use of our own structures, let's say our caves that we build as our houses, that these species can become especially successful in cities, and that this even translates in a better reproductive success of certain bird species in urban areas. In addition, as said, it's just a short summary of our knowledge. In addition, what do we know about trait patterns of other animals in urban areas? Well, generally, not only for birds, but also other animals, we do know that those species that can exploit urban areas, they usually are generalists with respect to feeding, so they can feed on a range of different diets, which is nice in urban areas because there is garbage lying around, and then there is people who feed animals, and yeah, then there is, for example, compost in the gardens, and yeah, grass along the streets. So many different food sources that animals can exploit if they're able to do so. And then also there is some indication that mammals that can live in urban areas tend to have larger litter size than the same mammals outside of urban areas. They also tend to have a larger brain size, an indication that probably the behavioral flexibility of a species can determine whether it can cope with urbanization or not. And there is also indication that mammals with a median body size tend to do especially well in cities. And this might be the case because large mammals, just think about, let's say, wolves, for example, they need a lot of food, so they need large areas to gather all the food that they need, and probably we will notice that they are there and we might not want them to be there in our cities. Small animals, on the other hand, just think about mice, for example, will have problems with crossing a street or other barriers, while intermediate species, such as foxes with a medium size, they might find enough food in cities, and they might not have such strong problems with crossing our barriers. So that might be why we often also find medium-sized mammals in our cities. Within our Urbionet group, we want to shed more light onto trade patterns of animals with respect to urbanization, and we collected across literature data for amphibians, bats, bees, birds, carabids, and reptiles, and we assigned traits to these, and now we are looking at whether these different groups have similar functional responses with increasing urbanization. But I'm sorry, we are still on the way, so I cannot present results this time. But instead, I want to jump to the next topic. What are the effects of urbanization on functional diversity? Pretty closely related, of course, to functional composition, but now more the question, is there more functional diversity, so a greater range of trait values in urban species communities compared to non-urban species communities or not? Here we could pose one hypothesis, or let's say two contrasting hypotheses. We could say that because urban environmental conditions are pretty harsh, just think about the urban heat island, high nutrient contents, pollution, sealed soils, and so on. We could say that, okay, this should really be a strong filter that restricts the functional diversity of species. On the other hand, we know that there is many different habitats in urban areas, so there might also be many different species with a range of different traits. So there might either be trait convergence or there might be trait divergence. Still, the literature, well, again, mainly focuses on plants, birds, and this time also arthropods, and I will show you what the literature says. Just as a first summary, results vary, as so often. I will first show you how urbanization affects functional diversity, at least for few studies that have investigated this question. And what you see here is from a study by Nock et al. They analyzed the functional diversity of trees in response to urbanization, as you see in the United States. They did so for a range of metropolitan areas: Minneapolis, Chicago, Washington, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Syracuse. And within each of these metropolitan areas, they investigated tree occurrence in sites of low urbanization intensity, medium urbanization intensity, and high urbanization intensity. And they then calculated, on the one hand, a taxonomic measure of diversity, Shannon diversity, and on the other hand, a functional measure of diversity, which is called Rao's Q. And this is what you can see in these little boxes that are under the map. So each box is for one metropolitan area. And then you see in each box green, yellow, and red signs. Green means these are the results for low urbanization intensity. Yellow means it's medium urbanization intensity. Red means it's high urbanization intensity. And then you always see pairs of signs. One sign always on the left-hand side with a roundish signature, that's always Shannon diversity. And then the figure on the right-hand side of the pair with the little triangle is always the result for Rao's Q, so for functional diversity. That's just for understanding. The summary is, no matter which city you look at, or basically for most of these cities, we see that with increasing urbanization intensity, both Shannon diversity and functional diversity decrease. So at least for this study, it seems that urbanization is negative for the functional diversity of vascular plant communities. Still, if we look at other research, at other papers, then we find that, for example, in South Africa, a comparison of grassland species in urban and non-urban sites showed that there was no difference in functional diversity. An analysis in Australia on non-native grassland species showed that these even increased in functional diversity with urbanization, in this case with road density. And then there was also a study by Zdenka and colleagues who analyzed across Europe the functional diversity of different urban habitats and found that this is usually lower than we would expect at random, so that indeed environmental filters are at work that lead to a functional trait convergence, so that functional diversity gets lower. Still, as you see, different studies give different results, and it's also not that many studies yet that investigated that question. So let's have a look at what does urbanization do to the functional diversity of animals. First, again, birds. Here is probably from its geographical range the most extensive that I found. It was by Hagen et al., published 2 years ago, and they investigated bird assemblages in urban areas, agricultural areas, and more or less natural areas across the sites that you can see as black dots in this map. What you can then see in the diagram is the observed functional diversity for the birds in urban areas. That's also always the gray boxes. In agricultural areas, that's always the orange boxes. And in natural sites, that's always the green boxes. And you see, no matter whether they looked at their complete data set, what they called global, or at the Western Palearctic or North America, they did not really find significant differences in the functional diversity of birds across these 3 land use types. It looks a bit different in South America, interestingly with a reduced functional diversity of birds in agricultural sites, but not in urban sites, but still there does not seem to be that strong effects. And also, if we then look at other papers again, we find that these find other results. So 2 studies, one by Pau and Lowe and the other one by Lasorte et al., they both found that urbanization decreases the functional diversity of birds. So maybe we need to take a closer look, and we shouldn't only look, let's say, from space on our urban area here and our non-urban area over there, but we should really have a look into cities and again have a look at specific drivers that could affect functional diversity. And indeed, 2 different studies found that if we look at the amount of sealed surface within a landscape, that the higher the amount of sealed surface is, the lower the functional diversity of birds gets. While on the other hand, in the same study, the higher the amount of green areas, the amount of parks in an urban area was, the higher the functional diversity of birds got. So it might depend, the functional diversity of species might depend on the way a city is designed, whether it's very dense or whether it also contains a high number and size of green areas. Then a short summary for arthropods, that also the people who do not work on birds but on animals have something to think about. Well, what I found in the literature on functional diversity of arthropods is first a study from Hungary, Debrecen, where spiders and rough beetles and also woodlice were investigated. And for the first 2 of these groups, there was no effect of urbanization on functional diversity. For the woodlice, there was indeed a decrease of functional diversity. But then for butterflies in Brazil, there was again no variation in functional diversity. For bees in Montreal, there was an increase in functional diversity with urbanization. And then in Berlin, again, sites with a higher herb cover increased functional diversity. So you see there is not that many studies yet, and there is also a high variation of results. So I cannot really answer the question, what does urbanization do to functional diversity? But let me jump into another measure. I hope you're not getting tired of this. But I know that several of you also worked on phylogenetic diversity, and it is also a interesting topic for you. So what do we know about the effects of urbanization on phylogenetic diversity? I hope that everyone has an idea what phylogenetic diversity is, kind of the diversity of evolutionary relationships among species, one could say. Again, with respect to this question, how does urbanization affect phylogenetic diversity? Mainly plants and birds, not surprisingly, have been investigated, but here the pattern seems to be pretty clear. No matter which group we look at and no matter which study we look at, usually we see that urbanization decreases functional diversity and also phylogenetic diversity and also phylogenetic relatedness. This is the case for plants, and here I want to present you a study that I conducted myself some years ago. It's an analysis of the flora of the city of Halle in central Germany. And one nice thing about Halle, not only that it's a really nice and green city, but one other nice thing is that botanists there have been pretty active within the last centuries. And we have in our opinion, pretty reliable data set that tells us what the flora of the region that today is covered by the city of Halle was in the year 1687. And we also have similar information from the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, up to the data obtained by Jens Stolle and Stefan Klotz just recently. And for this data, I had the honor to analyze how does biodiversity change among these roughly 320 years. I can tell you within this time frame, the area was urbanized. So 300 years ago, it was more like a bigger village or tiny town in an agricultural countryside. Today, it's mainly urban. And what we see, so to explain the graphs, on the x-axis, you always see time, starting on the left-hand side with the year 1687 and ending on the right-hand side with the year 2008. And then you see upper left, how species richness behaved, upper right, how phylogenetic diversity behaves, and down right, how average phylogenetic distinctness behaves. This is a measure of phylogenetic relatedness among species. And you can see this for the total flora. That's always the solid line with the bubbles. Then you see it for the native flora. That's always the dashed line with the quadrats standing on top. And then you see it for neophytes. That's always the lower line that is dotted with the triangles. To summarize this, over these 320 years, we saw an increase in the species richness of Halle. This increase in species richness was driven by an increase in neophytes. In 1687, there were 4 neophytes in Halle. Today, it's more than 130. Native species hardly changed in their species richness over that time frame. Some got lost, some entered the flora. Net change was hardly evident. So the increase in species richness was driven by neophytes. If we look at phylogenetic diversity, we see that although species richness increased, so today we have more species than in the late 17th century, phylogenetic diversity decreased. And it decreased for the total flora, although it increased a bit for neophytes and it didn't really change for native species. Still, in some, we see a decrease in phylogenetic diversity, and the same we see for average phylogenetic distinctiveness. So it seems that the neophytes that come in are pretty closely related to the species that were already there, and that those native species that got lost within the last 320 years, that these were, well, let's say, phylogenetically more distinct, not as closely related to other species as the ones that newly entered the flora. So, non-native species really seem to be one driver into this pattern, that phylogenetic diversity is lower in urban than non-urban areas. And Natalie Chaplova nicely showed a similar pattern, that the more non-native species we have in urban habitats, the lower phylogenetic diversity gets, if I remember correctly, I hope. And Also in the group of Carlo Ricotta, they showed similar patterns. So this really seems to be a quite consistent pattern. Now, what's the case for birds? I promised there is also some results on what's the phylogenetic diversity of birds in urban habitats. And there, the most comprehensive study that I know so far is the one by Daniel Sol, where he analyzed the data set that you can see here on the map. So quite nice global coverage. Daniel and his colleagues, they had bird occurrence data for birds in areas with a low urbanization level. That's always what you can see in the map as yellow signs. Then birds in moderately urbanized habitats, that's in the map everything that is blue. And birds in highly urbanized sites, that's in the map everything that is brown. So you can see that for all the sites that they investigated, they have bird occurrences in low, medium, and high urbanized sites. And this is then translated into this figure up left. This is first again species richness, and you nicely see that species richness of birds is highest in areas of low urbanization intensity, and it's lowest where urbanization is highest. Now, if we look at a measure of phylogenetic diversity, this is now called ED, evolutionary distinctiveness. It's again, I said, a measure of phylogenetic distinctness or diversity. We see the same pattern. It's highest where urbanization is low, and it's lowest where urbanization is high. And that's the case for native birds, and also if we combine native and non-native birds. So again, it seems that urbanization has a negative effect on phylogenetic diversity. It increases species richness, it decreases phylogenetic diversity, and well, for functional diversity, we don't know. So one last facet of diversity, genetic diversity. This will be a short one because there is hardly any research yet on the effects of urbanization on genetic diversity. At least I don't know much. If you know more, just tell me. I would be interested. Yeah. Well, we could hypothesize, if we think about how should urbanization affect genetic diversity, then we could say that, okay, because we have so many sealed areas, they should be a high isolation effect, and therefore genetic diversity should be reduced in urban areas, while genetic differentiation of different populations within an urban area should increase. Well, there is, as said, just one study that I know that tries to answer these questions, and it is on a tiny Brassicaceae species native to the United States, Lepidium virginicum, which you can see in the photograph. And the authors investigated again different metropolitan areas in the US, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, Detroit, and New York City. And they always had pairs. So they had populations of this Lepidium virginicum in urban sites and in rural sites. This is what you see in these in this map. It's always a pair of urban and rural sites. And to sum what they found, interestingly, if they compared the populations of Lepidium virginicum across these urban areas, they found that they were genetically more related across urban habitats than they were between urban and rural sites. For example, the individuals that grew in Minneapolis and St. Paul in the city were more closely related genetically to the species growing in Detroit or New York than they were to the species growing in the natural surroundings of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which also nicely shows that there are connections among urban areas that are maybe much stronger than connections such as traffic and trade than the connections among city and countryside. Okay, I think I'm running a bit short of time. Maybe some words anyway on effects of urbanization on the evolution of species. I told you this is an emerging topic, and just shortly, the hypothesis is that urbanization, because it has such strong effects on environmental conditions, should also have the potential to really affect the evolution of species. Again, not much research on this yet, but one very nice study, which I think is really nice, on grasshoppers, done by Lampe et al. They investigated, they collected nymph, so the non-adult grasshoppers within urban areas. Once along roads where it was really noisy. So non-adult grasshoppers from noisy roads, and they collected non-adult grasshoppers in parks where it was nice and quiet. Then they brought all of them in the laboratory and raised them, and then the adult grasshoppers were put into different chambers, one noisy chamber, which was as noisy as a road, and a quiet chamber. And male grasshoppers, they sing to attract females. And what Lampe et al. Did, they measured the frequency of this male singing. And what they found that first, wrong direction, when grasshoppers were in a quiet room, they sang with a lower frequency than when they were in a loud room. So frequency means not being louder, but let's say the ones sang darker and the others sang higher, just to illustrate it. That's like a plastic response. So it doesn't really tell us something about evolution, but about the plastic potential of species. Still, interestingly, always the grasshoppers that as non-adult grasshoppers grew up on noisy roads, they always had a higher singing frequency than the grasshoppers that grew up in a quiet park. So it seems that there is already some kind of adaptation to noise that might even affect the evolution of species in urban areas. And interestingly, at least for this plastic pattern, so a change in singing frequency with noisy or non-noisy habitat has also been shown for birds, for fish. I didn't know that fish communicate that way, but they change their way of communication with urbanization, and also with frogs. All of these tend to sing at higher frequencies, and some of them also tend to sing louder or at different times with increasing urbanization. So there's also intraspecific pattern. And we also find such intraspecific changes for plants, and we also find that these can be genetically fixed. But again, there is only one study on this Asteraceae species that you can see here, Crepis sancta, a tiny Asteraceae species growing, for example, in France. That's at least where it was investigated by Olivier Cheptou and colleagues. What they did, similar to the grasshopper study, they collected seeds of this Asteraceae species in highly fragmented urban areas, so where there is many different sealed areas, and in non-fragmented populations in the countryside. And they brought the seeds to a common garden and raised the plants, and then tested how they dispersed their seeds. And you have to know, to understand, that Crepis sancta is a plant species that has two strategies for dispersing its seeds. On the one hand, it has flying seeds, just as dandelion has. On the other hand, it produces seeds that cannot fly, that are just dropped close to the mother plants. And interestingly, what you can see in this diagram, what is shown in black are species originating from non-fragmented, from rural sites, and in gray you see species originating from highly fragmented urban sites. And you see that the proportion of these non-dispersing seeds, so the ones not able to fly, but the ones that are really just dropped close to the mother plant, increases for these species that originate from highly fragmented urban sites. And why is this the case? Well, the authors hypothesized that, of course, if a dandelion-like seed flies away from the mother plant in an area where there's a lot of sealed sites, the chance that it will land on such a sealed site is pretty high, and then, well, game over. So it's much safer for a plant to say, okay, then I drop my seeds close to myself because I have grown successfully. So the chance that my reproduction is successful should be higher. And interestingly, Cheptou et al. Also did a genetic analysis, and they show that this change in the proportion of non-dispersing and dispersing seeds is genetically fixed, and that the change works pretty fast, I think. Just within 5 to 12 generations, they found such changes, which also shows that evolution is not only something that works on long time scales, but really something that can happen pretty quickly if environmental drivers are strong, such as urbanization. Okay, and there is more research going on this, but now I think I've told you enough about what do we know about urbanization effects on biodiversity. Maybe you can remember at least some of it. But let me now go into where are the gaps. I already mentioned some of them, which you notice there is a strong taxonomic bias. Mainly birds and plants have been investigated, and within Urbionet we try to quantify this. So we again went through the literature, had a look at studies that investigated species diversity within urban habitats. And this is preliminary results, so we have several hundreds and thousands of papers we all need to go through. Not all of them are included yet, but most of them. So our preliminary results show that indeed most of the studies focus on vascular plants, more than a third of all studies. And this is followed by studies on birds. That's the chunk up here, 19.3% of the studies focus on birds, and other groups are far less represented. Especially if you look, for example, at reptiles or spiders, there is hardly any urban studies on these. And you might also notice that several animal taxa are not even mentioned here, such as fish or soil organisms. They hardly occur in urban biodiversity research. So in this respect, our knowledge really is restricted. And there is often studies only on one taxon, but not on several. Then our knowledge is also restricted in geographical terms. So mainly urban biodiversity research has by now focused on Europe and North America, also a bit on Australia, but the rest of the world, especially Africa, has mainly been neglected. And we cannot just transfer our results from Europe and say, okay, it might be the same in Africa. We just don't know. Also, this research is heavily biased towards the analysis of certain biodiversity indices. We asked in our review, if we looked at the different studies that we reviewed, does the study analyze taxonomic diversity, trait composition, functional diversity, or phylogenetic diversity, yes or no? Yes, you can see in blue, no, you can see in red. And you nicely see that most of the studies do investigate taxonomic diversity, more than 80% do. But if we come to trait composition, more than 60% don't look at it. And it gets even worse if we look at functional diversity and phylogenetic diversity. So I presented some papers to you, but really if we look at the broad urban biodiversity literature, then nearly 100% of these papers do neither look at functional nor phylogenetic diversity. So here still are large gaps in our knowledge. Then the fact is also that our spatial analyses of urban biodiversity, they usually focus on either broad scale, one could say coarse grain and broad extent. So like from the globe, we look at, here is an urban area, and we compare this to a non-urban area, such as done, for example, by Aronson et al. In this study with the colorful map on the left. Or the other way around, we go into one city, and within this one city we have a look at certain sites, like I did in my diploma thesis. You can see this on the right-hand side. That was an analysis of protected areas in Halle and its rural surroundings. But this was just for the city of Halle, so we cannot say anything about patterns in other cities. What we do need, I think, is what, for example, Stenka's group has been doing, that we really need to go into analyses of biodiversity, urban biodiversity across large extents, but find spatial resolution. So really have a look at different habitats within urban areas, but for many different cities across the world. And as said, not only in Europe and North America, and not only for vascular plants. Then it would also be pretty nice to have more long-term data. Most urban biodiversity research focuses on a tiny chunk of time, maybe 10 years if it works nice. This data set that I could analyze for Halle with the 320 years, it's really the longest that I know, and I think it's an exception to have such data dating back that long in time. So what we need, I think, it's not that easy to do, but there is a network of long-term ecological research sites. It mainly focuses on non-urban sites, but there are some urban long-term ecological research sites, and I think we should invest more into such long-term urban ecological research. Also, we should better investigate how our human behavior drives diversity. Why? Because, for example, just imagine you have a garden, and gardens often have a very high share of urban areas as a total. They can have a very high effect on diversity. Still, this very much depends on how you manage your garden. And how you manage your garden depends on your decision, your behavior. And then the question is, well, what does your behavior do to biodiversity? And how, or what factors influence your behavior? Maybe it is influenced by what your neighbors do, or what there is in the newspaper, or because you have some ecological knowledge, or because you like eating tomatoes, or whatever. But then the question would be, if we could understand how behavior drives diversity and what drives behavior, then we could maybe also find measures to, let's say, better inform people and better influence people, so that what we do, what we also as private persons do in cities, for example in gardens, will benefit biodiversity. I will skip this and just say that one thing that is also missing in urban biodiversity research is something that is pretty common in broader ecological research, and this is manipulative experiments, experimental research that controls for certain factors to find out which factors are really the most influential one. And yeah, there are some nice examples on such research in urban areas, but really it's not a lot. And there have been calls in the literature for more, like they say, mechanistic urban biodiversity research. So not only looking at patterns. What I presented to you in this short overview was mainly patterns of urban biodiversity, but not so much on why are the patterns the way they are. So we do not really know much about the processes that govern urban biodiversity, and here experiments might provide some insights. Okay, urbanization is increasing. We know that, I think it cannot be denied. The Convention on Biological Diversity projected that the land area that will be urban by 2030, in 11 years to be precise, that of this area, 60% is not existing yet. It still has to be built. So you can imagine that urbanization will increase vastly within the next years. It will especially increase in areas where urban biodiversity research has not been active, in Africa, for example, but it will also further increase in Europe, where it has already increased a lot within the last decades and centuries. To understand what this urbanization does to biodiversity, I think we need to fill the knowledge gaps which I mentioned, but I'm sure this is only part of the picture, just some ideas that we developed in Urbanet. We also, and this might be even more important, we need to, I think, better integrate the teaching of ecology with the teaching of, for example, urban planning or urban architecture, to really have more scholars in the future that have ecological knowledge, but that also know about the restrictions and needs of urban planning, and that therefore are able in the future to really plan and manage our urban areas in a way that they become more friendly to biological diversity. And I think this will also help in strengthening the relationships that we already have, that are already there among scientists on the one hand and practitioners on the other hand. We are on a good way, I think. So there are several networks that work on the fringe of science and policy. Urbionet is one of them. There is also Urbio, the international network in urban biodiversity and design, which strongly works also with landscape architects. Then there is the Society for Urban Ecology that also focuses on bringing together researchers and practitioners. In Germany, there is something called Kommunen für biologische Vielfalt, to translate it, municipalities for urban biodiversity. So it's a network of municipalities where people meet, I think, once a year. People who work in the municipality, in the administration, they meet once a year and they exchange their ideas how they could foster biological diversity in the cities. And there is also examples of such integrated studies where knowledge on ecology and knowledge on urban planning is combined. One is at Technical University Berlin called Ecology and environmental planning. The other is at Helsinki University, Helsinki and Aalto University, the Urban Studies and Planning Program. So there is examples of what I think we need more. As said, we are in a good way, but I think generally in science we need to step back from time to time, have a look at well, what have we been doing in the past? What are we doing right now? And where should we go to in the future? And yeah, maybe my talk gave you some ideas about this. I'm also interested in your criticism and ideas, and I thank you very much for your attention, for listening so late in the afternoon. Thanks for coming, and have a nice evening. Thank you. Yeah, there for sure is. There was one study. No, that was the wrong one. One study that investigated a so-called extinction depth in urban areas across the globe, and they found that in it's a long time ago I read it, but they found that in the older cities in Europe, more species have already been extinct than, for example, in the younger cities in Australia or in the US. And they hypothesized that this is a so-called extinction depth, so that populations in these newer cities are already declining, but the species haven't vanished completely yet, but they will so in the future. And yeah, I took this slide again because here is an effect, also the effect of age, city age or habitat age on diversity was investigated. You can see it here, age, and overall it seemed to have a slight negative effect on diversity. So I think there is not much evidence on that yet, but in general I think the number of rare species decreases over time. As I showed, species richness might increase, but other measures seem to decrease.
Vascular plants, but I wonder if the finding that there is a higher diversity of species richness in the vascular plants applies across the spectrum of vascular plants, or perhaps just some selected special groups. And the second, related to that, how many invasive species are found in those urban areas? Opposed to rural ones?
To the last question, I think numbers vary drastically. I must admit I don't know numbers by heart. I think the share of non-native plants in urban floras is much higher in Australia and New Zealand, for example, than it is in Europe or than it is in the US. So there is also a difference in different sites. For the example of Halle, as said recently, we have roughly 130 neophytes in the city, and we have a total of roughly 1,000 species, plant species in Halle, so it would be 13%, right? Okay. Yeah.
We should also summarize that in the cities there are 30% of alien species. So
30.
But alien species. So the highest proportion in different
Yeah, and concerning your first question, for sure different groups of vascular plants are differently affected, just due to their traits, but you were mainly asking for taxonomic groups, I guess. So one pretty easy example is that old plant species such as Lycopodium or Equisetum, or all these species that need swamps, bogs, and habitats like this, you won't find them any longer in urban areas. But on the other hand, species like Asteraceae, Rosaceae, and also I think Brassicaceae, they are pretty common. Yeah.
Quick follow-up. Are we here counting just the wild species or even cultivated ones, like for example apple trees in gardens and stuff like that?
Yeah, good question. I often forget to say that because it's so fixed in my mind, and I think it also differs among these different studies. In the studies I myself have been doing with colleagues, we usually only looked at the spontaneous flora and excluded the cultivated one. In other studies, such as, for example, the one on the functional diversity of trees in the US, I think they really looked at all the trees that occurred there, no matter whether they were planted or not. I think it's debatable. On the one hand, we could also, of course, say, if we look at the cultivated species, cultivation kind of overcomes the barriers or the filters that we have in urban areas. Just in your garden, if you're watering or fertilizing or plowing, you might overcome barriers that there usually are in urban areas. On the other hand, of course, what is planted also belongs to the species assemblages that they are in urban areas, and might also have effects such as on ecosystem services, for example, and on the functioning of ecosystems. For example, just a nice study that came out, I think 2 weeks ago, investigated the diversity of pollinators in different habitats across, I think, 5 cities in England, and they found that with a large difference, the highest number, by far highest number of pollinators was found in gardens, not in parks or even not in natural protected areas within cities, but in gardens, which emphasizes also the effects of cultivated plant species. Okay, great. So, thank you. I'm thirsty anyway, so might we go for some Czech beer? No? Another question? Sorry.
Yes, maybe I just forgot it. But yeah, but when talking about gardens, there's it's a pretty, I think, common knowledge that traditionally managed gardens with lots of crops and lots of trees and flowering plants are pretty good for biodiversity. And there is a fear of the effect of green concrete when people are cutting it down to the replacing the flowering plants with grass cut down to bare minimum and stuff like that. I'd like to ask, do you know about any studies that try to quantify those effects, or perhaps the rate of increase of such unfavorable garden management types, for example, anywhere, at least in Europe?
No, I do not know such studies. I know some studies by what's her name? Sorry, don't remember her name. A Russian researcher who works in Sweden. She showed that cities become more and more similar with respect to land use management. So no matter whether you look at a park in the United States or in Europe or in Asia, these are pretty similar to each other, which might lead to homogenization on a broader scale. But I don't know any study that really looks at the changes in, let's say, garden fashions on biological diversity. But maybe a question to you in this respect. In Germany, there is for several years now the fashion that people in their front gardens don't have even lawn, but they put gravel, black and white gravel in the front, and then they put maybe 2 pots with plants that they forget to water, and that's it. So does that crazy thing also exist here? Yeah. It's a pity. I think, yeah.
There's a rapid turnover from gardening artificial ponds and in a sense like alien tree species.
Yeah, I think it's like fast food. People don't have the time, or they think they don't have the time, and they forget that maybe in the evening sitting in a garden and instead in front of a gravel bed might be more relaxing for their minds, right?
Are there some next questions or comments?
Yes. Yeah, for birds, I know this distinction of urban avoiders, urban exploiters, and one in between. Yeah, and for plants, there is this scheme developed by Rüdiger Wittig some decades ago, where he said there are urbanophobic plants, urbano-neutral plants that don't care whether they grow in the countryside or in town, and urbanophilic plants, which are preferably found in cities. I think the concept is useful, but it needs to be underlined. So if we say, okay, a bird species is an urban exploiter, we still need to know why is it an urban exploiter, which traits make him an urban exploiter. Yeah. Especially in South America. Yeah. I don't remember exactly what the authors wrote, but to me the South American pattern is kind of logical. Well, I don't know what type of agricultural land use they compared it to, but if we think about pretty intensive agricultural land use, which produces, let's say, maize across hectares and hectares of land, where we have really on huge areas the same crop, the same fertilizer, the same pesticide, hardly any other species, then why should there be a high functional diversity of birds or any other group? Of course, maybe if we look at extensive, diversified agriculture, the picture might look different. So I suspect, without really knowing, that the pattern that we see here is due to intensive agriculture, which decreases the diversity of birds. You're not convinced? Yeah, that's at least a driver that is also often discussed for species richness, why species richness of vascular plants tends to be higher in urban areas, also because many species got lost due to intensive agriculture. And it's also a pattern discussed for phylogenetic diversity. So there is a study from, I think, Central America, again on the phylogenetic diversity of birds, where they were investigated in forests, extensive agriculture and intensive agriculture, and there it was clearly shown that phylogenetic diversity of these birds is pretty much lower in the intensive agricultural sites than in the extensive agricultural sites and in the forests. So it was highest in forests, but still extensive agriculture did much better than intensive agriculture did. Yeah, thank you a lot. thanks again for the invitation and thanks for listening and questioning. Have a nice evening.